Well, welcome to everybody. It's about 1:30, so we're going to get going. The disembodied voice you're hearing is Ruth Cole-Burkaw. I'm the Executive Director of the Board of Cooperative Ministries. A couple of logistical things for our meeting today. You, as an attendee, you are muted, as well as your video is also turned off. And we will be asking our questions through the chat box. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, or if you tap your screen for your menu, you should have an icon that says chat. If you click that, then you should be able to see what's happening in the chat. Be sure when you do ask your question, ask it to all panelists and attendees. It's a little drop-down box next to the two. And that way, both our panelists, those of us sort of behind the scenes who are presenting, we'll be able to see it, as well as the rest of the attendees. So that is some important news for you. The first person I want to kick things off with is the Reverend Keith Starwell, who's the Program Director for Faith Health at Wake Forest Baptist Health. He's also a chaplain and physician assistant, and I'm gonna bring him in and have him get us kicked off here.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ruth, for inviting me today to be part of this. I'm going to start us off with a prayer that actually I wrote as part of an invocation. Some of you may be aware, but each morning, Wake Forest Baptist Health and representatives from all of our hospitals gather these days electronically to talk through what are primarily safety issues, but part of this process is involved in invocation every Monday morning. Well, these are different times. And because of that, we're now doing, meaning the chaplains, an invocation every single morning, including the weekends for our staff. So what I want to share with you today is actually something that was born out of an interview with WFDD and issued to my colleagues at Wake Forest Baptist Health. But I think we can all read through this and understand that the arms, so to speak, the metaphorical arms of this message applies to all of us in these extraordinary times. So,
Keith, I'm going to interrupt you just briefly to, it looks like I've got to ask you to start your screen, so you've got to click a button so that you can, so they can see your face. We want them to see your face.
Are you sure about that? Bear with me. I have about 4 screens open, so let's see.
There you are.
There we are. Okay.
We see you now. Thank you.
So
sorry to interrupt your flow.
That's all right. That's all right. So I will share this message that I shared with our people just a couple Thursdays ago. We were asked why we relit the Moravian star on top of Baptist Hospital. So here's my response. Normally, we light this Moravian star during Advent, a time focused in flux, where we live in an uncertain present, yet also in hope of things to come. The star is a symbol of hope and love with the promise of reconciliation and peace. We relit this star, as many Moravians and others have chosen to do, as an extraordinary sign in extraordinary times. Its light reminds us of our perseverance in this time that might otherwise be seen as so dark. But I'm reminded that it's the points of the star that take this light of perseverance and provide us unity. To me, the points remind us of my medical colleagues at Wake Forest Baptist Health and others. They remind me of the dedication of those who keep ours and other hospitals and clinics open. They remind me of the folks who keep the spaces clean, who feed us, and the administrative and financial folks who keep the institution running. They are points on this star. The first responder community, the folks at the grocery stores and pharmacies, the delivery drivers, those city and county employees who keep us safe and functioning. They are points on this star. Yes, we relit this star in an extraordinary way in an extraordinary time, in hope and honor and thanks as we come together in this time that seems so dark. We gather together under the light of the star, pulling together to receive and reflect this light as we remind others that hope remains. Amen and amen. I'm pleased today to introduce the panelists for today's focus called Approaching Light, Caring for Our Souls Through Trauma. What I'll do is I'll go through the introductions of all the presenters, and then they will come on one by one. And of course, we'll then have time for question and answers at the end. And the first person I want to introduce is someone very special to me, and that is Andrea Simons, who is our first palliative care fellow here at Wake Forest Baptist Health. And she's done so well this year, despite having me as a mentor. I've just been very impressed with Andrea's work, and she's done a lot of work with grief as well in the church and of course here in the hospital. So she's the palliative care chaplain fellow at Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center. She works with many people actively grieving and experiencing loss. In her unique role, Andrea meets people as they are, wrestling with a variety of losses, from a death, loss of limb, loss of independence, or their own mortality as they chose to speak or choose to stop aggressive treatments. Hers is a ministry of presence. Robert Rominger, PhD, is a licensed psychologist serving as an assistant professor in the Department of Internal Medicine at Wake Forest University Medical Center in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He's a member of Cooperative Hills, Moravian Church in Winston-Salem. Dr. Rominger helps people move from despair to hope in his clinical practice. He's active in suicide prevention advocacy and is one of the founding members of the North Carolina chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. The Right Reverend Lane Sapp is the senior pastor of Calvary Moravian Church, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, serving this congregation since 1996. He graduated from High Point College with a major in religion, then attended Moravian Theological Seminary in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he received his Master of Divinity degree in 1987. Lane was ordained on June 14th in 1987 at Clemens Moravian Church, his home congregation. In 1987, he was called to be an organizing pastor of Good Shepherd Moravian Church in Kernersville, North Carolina. At the Synod of 2002, he was elected a bishop of the Worldwide Moravian Unity and was consecrated at Calvary Moravian Church on July 7th. Kay Windsor is a member of New Philadelphia Moravian Church, a writer, a writing group leader, and a retired teacher. She leads writing through grief sessions for Trellis Supportive Care, a place near and dear to my heart in the work that I do, a local hospice, and a community group. She's been writing with a group of other mothers who have lost children for 2 decades and published a book, Farther Along, the writing journey of 13 bereaved mothers in 2012. She administers a blog called Further Along for writing and resources for those who've experienced grief. And so we welcome our panelists for today. And I start off by reintroducing Andrea Simons, who, in addition to all the wonderful things she does here, is the youth minister for Parkway United Church of Christ. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you, Keith, for that introduction. I wasn't really sure what I'd talk about today from my clinical standpoint and also from my background in general with personal experience with grief. But I thought I'd start by talking about the ways grief shows up in the clinic whenever I go to meet patients who are either palliative care patients or they're patients who are either facing a loss of a limb or facing the loss of independence if they get a colostomy bag or they have to spend their life relying on catheters. And I thought I'd start also by saying like the different types of grief and why grief is important to discuss in relation to trauma, because all of us have grief. Like your grief never leaves you. Sometimes you're better at handling it other days, and sometimes it overwhelms you. It comes in waves. And so there's anticipatory grief, which I think was happening right before the coronavirus got to us, to the United States, where we're waiting and we're anticipating, like, how is this going to affect my life? Is it going to hit my loved ones? And then, it's here, it's on top of us and us having to adjust to it. And there's a new kind of grief that we're facing in the hospital right now as chaplains. We're having a lot of patients who cannot have their loved ones with them. We have visitor restrictions in place. And unless you're actively dying, which means like you're going to die within the next 24 to 48 hours, and to be honest, who can really tell you that? you can't have someone here. And if you're a COVID-19 patient, then you can't have anybody at all. And so you have complicated grief then. You have the trauma of not getting to say goodbye. You have the trauma of not getting to stay with your person and hold their hand and make sure they're not afraid. And all of that together, it makes your grief process complicated, because for a lot of people, they need to see a body. They need to be able to say goodbye. And we further have it complicated by the fact we can't have funerals right now. Or if you do have a funeral, they're virtual, or you can only have a few people there. So there's just a bunch of different things that are going on in the world right now. And I think also trauma does this thing where, you know, like your grief and your experiences in the past don't stay there. They're always being carried with you. And so I think this trauma that we're all collectively going through together, you know, with coronavirus hitting us and changing our lives, like, it changes your brain. And it also dredges up from the deep, sometimes things you haven't thought about in years that still affect you. And so not only are you having to deal with the fact that your life has changed, but also all the stuff that's coming up you haven't thought about for a while. So I thought I'd transition from that to, okay, so all this horrible stuff is happening, grief is happening, trauma is happening, and how do we sit with ourselves and other people in the midst of it? So one of the pastoral care images that I use in my ministry in the hospital, it comes from the book of Job. And it's one of my favorite pastoral care images. And you might not even have considered it, but this is one that I constantly come back to, because there's not really the right words to say when someone's grieving or someone's going through something horrible. There are a lot of things you can say wrong, like, you know, like there's a whole slew of just bad theology out there that could come up. But the image that I use is from Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. And I'll probably butcher the names because it's been a while since I've had Hebrew, but here we go. It says, "Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven." And this is the part that I love. It says, "And then they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great." And so sometimes the best thing you can do for people, and I know it's really hard right now because we have I hate the word social distancing. We have physical distancing going on right now. But there's still ways to be close to people without having to be physically near them. And I think if even you just call someone and say, "Hey, I was just calling to see how you're feeling and checking in, and I'm not here to offer advice, I'm just here to listen," I think that's a great gift you can give to people. And something else I'd like to say about grief is that there's this beautiful image, and it's kind of funny when you look at it. It shows like a huge dip, and there's 2 side-by-side pictures, and one suggests that the grief process is linear. So like you have all the stages, and then right next to it, it has the same graph, but a bunch of squiggles in it, because grief isn't linear. And that's not how everybody's experience is, because when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was coming up with those 5 stages of grief, they were being applied to people who were actually actively dying and how they were dealing with their own mortality. And they've been taken and been misapplied to people who are grieving the loss of a loved one. So people are often hard on themselves and often are hard on others, probably not meaning to be, because they care about people. Like, you try to comfort and fix things because you care about folks, and it makes you uncomfortable when they're hurting because you want them to feel better. So it's not always coming from a bad place, but just to be aware that grief's not linear. We need to give ourselves grace and other people grace. And a lot of times I hear people say, "Gosh, I just wish I was over this by now. I thought I went through all the stages." And that's not how it works. That's not how life works. And, you know, you hear people say, well, my wife lost her mother a year ago, but she's still really sad. And I thought she'd be over it by now. And really, grief affects people differently. There's no right way or wrong way to respond when you're grieving or when you're in like your trauma response mode. But there is a way for us to show up for people and create a space to where we can hold that with them. We don't necessarily have to fix their emotions or feelings, but we can definitely provide a safe space for them to feel like, okay, I'm not broken, first of all. There's not something wrong with me. And also, on another note, like if someone is having a really, really hard time, like I hate the word normal as well, because I feel like there's no way, like that nothing's really normal, and things really aren't normal right now either. But if someone seems to like be having a harder time than usual with something, you know, maybe suggesting that they talk to someone who's a professional. If you're really concerned about them becoming depressed or hurting themselves, like there's never a wrong time to just be like, hey, have you considered, you know, getting some extra help if you're really concerned about somebody. But telling them to get over it is definitely not helpful. So just some takeaways from my thing is, you know, sit with people, listen to them, let them know you're there for them, and always ask when they're talking to you, do you want advice or do you just need me to listen? Thank you.
So our next speaker is Dr. Robert Rominger.
Actually, it's actually Lane. Sorry, Keith.
Oops, our next speaker is Bishop Lane Sapp.
I want to piggyback a lot on what Andrea just said, because in the notes that I had written this morning, a lot of what she voiced, I would piggyback on. I think one of the most important things that I've found in this time is the value of listening. And I think that's what people I'm experiencing need more than anything, is somebody just to hear their feelings, no matter what they are. I was talking to somebody the other day by Zoom, and this person said to me, I just don't understand why I can't get anything done. I've got all this time on my hands, and I'm not productive. And they went on to talk about all the other things they were feeling. And through the conversation, we sort of came to an understanding that perhaps a lot of this was grief oriented. And the person said, you know, maybe that's what it is. I'm grieving what life used to be or what I cannot do. And all of that grief is coming out in this variety of different feelings. So I think just being there and your willingness to listen. Andrea said something about making telephone calls. That's what I've been trying to do a lot as a pastor right now. Normally I would visit, so I'm trying to call. There are people that prefer email. I've done a lot by email or by text. Some folks have wanted to have a Zoom conversation, but I think it's that contact to let people know that somebody cares and that they want to listen to what it is they're going through, no matter what it is. The story from Job, I think, is so important because, as Andrea said, sometimes in our efforts to want to help people or to make them feel better, we say all kinds of things that are not in the long run very helpful at all. But just listening is the greatest gift that we can give to somebody. The other thing that I've found is trying to be as much of a non-anxious presence as we can possibly be, with family, with friends, with parishioners, with patients, and even using some humor. I think humor is really needed right now, but to simply offer the assurance that somehow through all of this, if we're held in God's embrace, we're going to be okay. Doesn't mean we're not going to suffer or we're not going to go through anything or experience death or sickness, but that if we believe in a God who holds us and is merciful, that God somehow will take care of us all through this. So I found myself quoting a lot of times that beautiful phrase from Julian of Norwich that all will be well. In time, all will be well. And I sense that people really need to hear the assurances of their faith in this time. The other thing that Andrea mentioned, I'm trying to pay very close attention to social media. A lot of folks that I know who are members here and otherwise are on Facebook or on Instagram, and sometimes I will pick up in some of their comments struggling. So I might try and turn to send them a private message or even call them and say, you know, I noticed what you said, and I'm just concerned about you, and I just wanted to call and see how you are. And I found that that's been a very helpful thing to do as well, to try and be as sensitive as we can possibly be. And the last thing I would say is just give each other the permission to be, and to deal with this as we need to, whether that's sitting down reading a book, or that's doing a craft, or that's doing nothing, or that's working in the yard. Whatever it is that people need to do to cope with the situation, to affirm that and to give permission that it's okay. And I found that very helpful as well. So those are just some thoughts from a pastoral perspective.
Thank you. And now we have Dr. Rominger.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to come at this from, I like the thoughts that Lane and Andy have already shared, particularly the notion that grief changes your brain. I think that's a reality. And Lane's point that a lot of us are grieving what life used to be. And that actually applies to all of us. I don't think there's anybody who's not been impacted by this in terms of a real gut punch to our sense of what reality is or should be. But I'll be kind of coming from an individual psychological perspective. And I'm thinking of that in part because as helpers, we need to be managing our own reaction to what's going on. It's to reference that old illustration of building a plane, flying a plane while it's being built. We're all in the midst of this turmoil ourselves. And so how we look at it, I think, is critical. I wrote down, if trauma is the tunnel, let me show my first slide. If trauma is a tunnel, what's the light at the end of it? I think individually, what gives us meaning or calls us towards some kind of move out of this darkness is different. But as I think about the concept of light, there are a lot of other terms I thought of as well. And I just kind of randomly listed a lot of things here. And this is not a comprehensive list, but for the point that I wanted to make is that for each of us, finding our own light is critical to coping with the darkness. You know, what drives us? What helps us feel better about ourselves? What helps us feel better about the circumstances that we're in? And I want to look at some thoughts from a particular psychologist, somebody who was very influential among the cognitive psychologists. He died just in 2013, but his name is William Glasser. And Glasser promoted the notion that how we feel and how our body responds is driven by our thoughts and our behaviors. So it's our choice of what we focus on that determines how well we get along with the world and how we feel about ourselves. And I picked a few of his quotes that I like. One of these, the first is fundamental to what he believed about what motivates us, that we're driven by the needs of survival, love and belonging, power, freedom, and fun. And these all have their place in that concept of light that I'm talking about for each of us, that our self-fulfillment, so to speak, is going to be meeting these fundamental needs. He also said, we may be up against a stone wall, but we don't have to bloody our heads against it unless we choose to. And his point is that the circumstances may be dire, they may be terrible, but how we look at them fundamentally gives us either relative power over them or makes us feel like we're being victimized. And one of the things that I think a challenge that we all have right at this time in our history is to overcome whatever temptation we have to feel like we're victims. There are realities that we don't control, but are we going to beat ourselves up against those realities, or are we going to try to come to some kind of acceptance and to cope? The other thing I think about is people are being confined either by themselves or sometimes with the people who are the closest to them. And there's a pressure cooker kind of thing going on. And we're learning perhaps things about our loved ones we wish we didn't know, or or things we're familiar with, but we kind of like it when we don't have to deal with this 24/7. But it's important to be kind to ourselves and be kind to others. And this quote, if everyone would learn that what's right for me does not make it right for everyone else, then the world would be a much happier place. We have to make space for ourselves, and we have to make space for other people that's different from our space. So with that in mind, the next chart on the next slide is something that we can look at to kind of think in terms of, are my behaviors helping or hurting? Are they bringing me closer to other people, connecting me, or am I trying to control people? So this is a wonderful time in our lives for self-examination. We have more time for that in some cases than we might have ever had before. One of the things that happens there's questions about the new normal and that sort of things. One of the things that happens with these kind of upsurges in our perception of reality, it's a time to re-examine ourselves. So is our behavior making us harder to get along with or easier? Are we blaming, are we criticizing, complaining, nagging? Are we trying to control other people? Are we threatening or punishing them? When we're at our worst, we may fall into that kind of pattern of behavior. On the other hand, and this is very consistent with what Lane was talking about, and with Andrea's concept of sitting with somebody, the connecting habits, the listening, supporting, encouraging, negotiating, respecting, accepting, and trusting. And I think that's critical to kind of bringing harmony to our homes, and that may be something that's a little more difficult when we're spending as much time as we are not doing what we want to do. And I think that part of what we grieve is just that not having the freedom. Remember, freedom is one of the core motivating needs that we have. And when we feel that our freedom is threatened, some of the, let's say the higher values that we have might fall by the wayside, and we might find ourselves getting defensive and acting in more controlling ways. So we need, I don't want us to be too self-judgmental, but I do want us to be very aware and to try to take more of that control by making better choices about how we put, where we put ourselves, where we put our energies, where we put our thoughts. Let's go on to the next slide. And I just put together, this is for the folks in the Winston-Salem area, because that's what I'm familiar with. There are going to be other resources that will be available to people that have been part of this webinar. But I broke down mental health resources into certain categories, and I picked just a representative sample. The point of sharing this is also to point out that we're not alone. We really can feel isolated when we're spending more time in our home or spending less time in face-to-face interactions with people. There are, in all of these cases, all that I put down for contact was that phone number, because more and more places realize that the only safe way to connect with people is by phone. So I listed CareNet Counseling, I listed the Trinity Center and Associates in Christian Counseling as all places that are that offer counseling, but also have the sensitivity to people coming at their issues from a spiritual point of view. On the next slide, we have resources that hopefully none of us are going to find that we need, but we want to know that they're there. Cardinal Innovations is our kind of our umbrella agency that is that assures a network of services for mental health needs around this community, and they have an access number for referral and for dealing with crises. Daymark, under the sponsorship of Cardinal, has a 24-hour urgent care center, and the phone number for that is there. Old Vineyard Behavioral Health is a residential program, and I've found it to be very beneficial for people that need to be safe. They need to be somewhere safe for a while. As part of my work with AFSP, I've become aware of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and the work that they do. It's a national network, but each or almost every state has a crisis clinic that takes the calls in that state. So it comes a little bit closer to home when you do call that. You don't have to be suicidal to call the Lifeline, but the fact that it's a 24-hour-a-day resource, I think, is real important. This applies wherever you live, of course, not just here in North Carolina. Again, just in our local community, there are more resources than these, but some of the main ones that I think are good to know about are here at Wake Forest, or our psychiatry department, Devon Behavioral Health, and I should add they also have, both of these places have inpatient emergent hospitalization as an option, but they also spend a lot of time helping people balance out their medications to make sure that they're able to function as well as they can. Monarch is one of the mental health agencies under the Cardinal umbrella that provides counseling, but it also does a lot of just medication management. And the Mood Treatment Center is a center started by a psychiatrist here in town, Chris Aiken, and that's another resource here in this community. I picked them because of their size and their influence. To small but large practice in terms of its impact. All right, and then for some of us, one of the things that we all might have noticed is that when essential businesses were identified when the state shut down, the ABC stores are essential. And one of the rationales for that is that people who are addicted to alcohol may actually go through withdrawal if they don't have access to it. So as we're in our close quarters around family, or we're concerned about somebody that might be separated from us physically, but we don't know, and we're concerned about their behavior, knowing what the resources are for them. Daymark, again, is a mental health agency, but it focuses largely on providing services for substance abuse. Insight Human Services is a similar agency that offers substance abuse treatment in the form of groups and individual counseling. ARCA is an inpatient resource that will help people with detox and with kind of getting on the path to recovery. It's a step to getting clean. And then I learned about the value of social media for NA and AA through my patients. They're the ones that informed me about this. But now we have, for Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, people are actually having their meetings online. And so I listed the web addresses for those. And let's see. And then the last group of things are the more community support, grassroots kind of organizations. Again, this is not by any means an exhaustive list, but knowing that these things are out there, I think can help your, just help you maintain your own equanimity, let's say. Triad Mental Health Association is a wonderful organization here in Winston-Salem. Actually, it's technically the Forsyth County Mental Health Association, but it's kind of generically known as the Triad Mental Health Association. And they have moved their support groups that have been a very, very important part of our community to an online format. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has tons and tons of resources, including when in this time that we're all sequestered. They have posted so many informative videos. Now is the time that some people might actually be able to look at some of those videos on research, some campaigns on trying to help people that are suffering. They have a campaign called Seize the Awkward, for instance, with lots of entertaining short videos. NAMI is a great grassroots organization, does a lot of advocacy at the national and state levels too. And there's the contact information for them. And then the last thing I want to point out is we also have each other. We need to respect that we have people that love us and that we can be there for them and they can be there for us. All right, and now and then I just want to end with a musical interlude. One of the ways that I cope is through writing music. It keeps me sane in all kinds of circumstances, I believe. But I do get criticism from my family that I often just write snarky songs. So for my wife's birthday one year, I wrote her this song because I wanted to remind my family that I can write pretty songs. My daughter last night, even though she was having a migraine, she agreed to put a vocal on this for me. So I consider her kind of a stay-at-home hero right now. So you can look at the words as she sings this song.
And a light shines in the darkness, and it lingers as we roam. When the world is weighing hard on us, it will guide our way back home. And a light shines in the darkness, like a vestige of the day, to awaken us to hardiness and illuminate our way. And the light shines in the darkness, it is there to give us hope, an oasis in the wilderness. When we find it, we can cope. And the light shines in the darkness, even though the night seems bleak. Through its radiance it pardons us, and we find it when we seek. And a light shines in the darkness, when infused by it we be. For the light becomes a part of us, and a share becomes our theme. And the light shines in the darkness, and it lingers as we roam.
That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm Kay Windsor, and as I share a little bit this afternoon, I'm not sharing as a professional, but as a layperson, as a writer who has written about grief and written with people who are grieving. And so writing is the main thing I'll offer. I found a Richard Rohr daily meditation yesterday that I'd like to share a little excerpt from. It's called Why Suffering? Sooner or later, the heart of everybody's spiritual problem is what do we do with our pain? Why is there suffering? Job begs God for an answer to this mystery and he can't get one. He only begins to trust when he no longer feels ignored, when he knows that God is taking him seriously and that he is part of the conversation. And this is, the reference is Job 42. So that's another theme we're continuing today. When Jesus later becomes the answer in his own passion, death, and resurrection, he discovers what Job finally experienced. In the midst of suffering, God can be trusted. The world is still safe, coherent, and even blessed. We're saved by being addressed and included in a cosmic conversation. We do not really need answers. We need only to be taken seriously as part of the dialogue. But we usually only know this in hindsight after the suffering and the struggle. It cannot be known beforehand, not theoretically or theologically. Our knowledge of God is participatory. God refuses to be intellectually thought and is only known in the passion and pain of it all when the issues become soul-sized and worthy of us. That's where transformation most easily happens. That's when we're uniquely in the hands of God. Right now, it seems the whole world is in the belly of the beast, like Jonah, together. But we're also safely held in the loving hands of God, even if we do not fully realize it. The genius of Jesus' teaching is that he reveals that God uses tragedy, suffering, pain, betrayal, and death itself, not to wound or punish us, but to bring us to a larger identity. Unless the single grain of wheat loses its shell, it remains just a single grain. The shell must first crack for the expanded growth to happen. And that reminded me of there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, from Leonard Cohen's anthem. In such divine economy, everything can be transmuted, everything can be used, and nothing is wasted. So that was adapted from Richard Rohr and John Feister's Hope Against Darkness, the transforming vision of St. Francis in an age of anxiety, and from Richard Rohr's Just This. And the image you're seeing is a Van Gogh, wheat field with crows. So a few suggestions for being present to suffering and grief. Acknowledge with someone the suffering and grief without trying to fix it or offer empty positives. And I think that's what Andrea said to us, and some others have said as well. Often in our culture, grief is denied or covered up or swept aside. It doesn't fit with the view of independence and self-reliance that we sometimes embrace. So acknowledge grief, acknowledge the suffering, listen, be a witness without trying to change things. So we can often just be present and we can walk beside someone. And as Lane said, we can listen. And we should acknowledge that each of us grieves differently. We don't always know the backstories that brought someone to this place. And that was reflected in the Richard Rohr meditation as well. What I have offered and what I have found to be a saving grace for me is reflective writing. I began writing a daily examen during Gemeinschaft more than 20 years ago. And then I continued writing with a group who we now call ourselves Farther Along, because we believe writing has brought us farther along in grief and in life. And reflective writing can have those powerful effects on coping with trauma or grief. This can be something you do, something you offer to someone who's grieving. And I just read today this sentence that seems to reflect what writing does for me. Occasionally, she takes sips of sorrow, afraid the big wave might wash her away. And that's from Julia Alvarez's new book called Afterlife. And she was grieving, or trying to figure out how to grieve after having lost a husband in that piece. I began using reflective writing with the research of James Pennebaker, and the more recent book that is called Expressive Writing, Words That Heal. And he, since the 1980s, has done studies that show writing about traumatic events, even 20 minutes a day for 3 or 4 days, can produce, I can't see my slide for the panelist list, sorry, changes in physical and mental health. And there is evidence from studies that new neural pathways can be formed. We can change the course of our grief through writing. We can, I know this maybe sounds like a little bit like pseudoscience. It isn't, and that's why I gave you Pennebaker. I went to see a physician a few years ago, and he didn't know that I had been leading writing groups for people in grief through Trellis and in a community group and with a group. And he said, I think what you need to do is go home and write about this, something that hasn't been resolved. Write 20 minutes a day for 4 days and read what you've written the day before beginning the next day. And I thought, I think I've heard that before, but I did it. I followed his prescription. I found that it did help me reframe what was going on. And the writing that you do or that you help others to do doesn't have to be a polished piece of anything. It can be a note, or a response to a poem or a prayer. One of the most powerful readings I did, and please don't tell anybody at the archives this, but years ago when I was on the Board of Archives and we were moving from the old building to the new, I was sent up to the attic and told I could pack up all the daily texts from ministers in the 18th, 19th centuries. But the admonition was, but don't read any of them. And for somebody who grew up sneaking to read all the books in the bookcase when I was supposed to dust them, and when I was there by myself, that just wasn't a very good instruction. Sheryl Sandberg, who is from Silicon Valley, co-wrote a book called Option B, and she talks about 3 Ps and gratitude lists. And let me see if I can tell you. She talks about the first P being personalization, the belief that we are at fault. And if you heard anything from that Richard Rohr meditation, we are not at fault for the grief, and the personalization that sometimes happens in grief is different from taking responsibility, which you should always do. It's the lesson that not everything that happens to us happens because of us. And if you can get past that personalization in grief, you can actually become stronger. I think with isolation, at our church, I think some of the people who suggested this may be in the group today, but We have a Zoom room for people to call in who don't have computers, who can't access the live stream and online versions of our worship. So they call Chicago, put in a meeting number. They're connected to my computer here in Winston-Salem, and I share my screen and live stream services. But what's really wonderful is they don't always know that everybody else in this room, my room, can hear them, and they'll sing along or make conversation with each other afterward. And they said that this helps stave some of the isolation and the grief of being apart. Sheryl Sandberg's second P is pervasiveness, and it's the belief that an event will affect all areas of your life. Now, that would be a little hard not to believe right now in the middle of coronavirus isolation, but the third P she mentions is permanence, the belief that sorrow will last forever. And if you are in the midst of pain, chronic illness, for example, it is really easy to think that this is what will last forever. But I think it's important, if we tell each other something, it's what Lane mentioned, that this too will pass. And let's see if I can find one more thing. The daily examen I mentioned, and a version of that is what I began doing in Gemeinschaft years ago. And I started with the question, where have I seen God in my life today? And I also added, where have I served God in my life today? But the examen, or the kind of daily reflection that Sheryl Sandberg and some others suggested, are writing 5 gratitudes, writing 5 things you're grateful for. And that sounds counterintuitive if you're in the middle of grief or suffering, but if you start with one thing you're grateful for and found 5 things about it that you're grateful for, that might be a start. It really works. And I believe that I don't think I have another slide, do I, Hannah? Yes, I do. All right. So I'll just mention that these are some resources that I've used in the past. I've given these books away or used them in writing groups. A Grace Disguise, How the Soul Grows Through Grief. I think that it's the rest of the title. And farther along is the book to which I contributed, but I mention that because at the end of it, there's a large section of prompts for writing. And these can be used individually. They can be used in a group. Writing Alone and with Others is a book that tells how Pat Schneider actually has written with populations, women who are have been in trauma, women and others who've been abused, and there are prompts in that book that can be used alone or with others. I mentioned the small little book called Grief Therapy because at the beginning of the time when I had the greatest grief in my life, I couldn't read anything, I couldn't write anything, I couldn't do anything for a while. And someone gave me this tiny little book called Grief Therapy. It's an help book. The publisher used to be Abbey Press. I think Care Notes may be the publisher now. But one page in it said, "Your grieving is among the most sacred and most human things you will ever do. It will plummet you into the mystery of life and death and resurrection. Honor it." So that was my hope in sharing writing. And I think now I need to transition to questions.
So thank you very much to our panelists. We have a number of questions in the comment section. We're going to try to get to them all. And if for some reason we accidentally skip over yours, please let us know. One of the first ones I see is from Peggy Dodson, and she asks the panelists, do you distinguish between emotional and mental health, and I would add spiritual health to that as well.
I'm waiting for one of the professionals to answer, but I would say they're all related: spiritual, mental, emotional.
That's what I was gonna say too, that we're human. Like, you ever see that C.S. Lewis quote that says, you're a soul that's in a body that's having all these experiences? Like, all of it's tied together. And I think if one's out of whack, then the others are out of whack as well. And we're experiencing things in these bodies, so you have to take care of them. And you also have to feed your spirit and your emotional health as well.
I think if you look at that, the Greek word for salvation, it's a holistic well-being. And I think that, research is showing us more and more that all these various parts of our life are connected. And it's really important to see that one is related to the other and they all have an effect on one another. That's how I would see it.
I would agree.
So from Gregorio Moody, how to face challenges of attending grief issues through virtual media and social distancing. And what unique ways would you address these issues, realizing that, that unfortunately we're going to have to use electrons in a different way?
As someone that hates making phone calls and I'm forced to do that now, I realize that the human connection is still a human connection, and like Andrea said, we're not socially distant. We're not socially distant. We're physically distant. It is an obstacle, but I do think that that we are, let's say, blessed that we at least have social media, that we do at least have phones, that we can connect with people at least in that medium. But there's definitely something lost, but that's perhaps something that we need to grieve ourselves and figure out a way to move past it.
Gregorio, I was going to say probably Ruth and Hannah from BCM could help you even more with this, but I know here at Calvary Moravian, it was $149 to sign up for Zoom that's unlimited for a year. But I think you can also have a private account that you can be on, I think, for 40 to 45 minutes without paying. And I found that congregation members have really responded to that, to having conversations by Zoom once they sort of work through the issues of using it. It's not very hard at all, but I found that very effective.
Yeah, if you have a group of 3 or more that need to meet on Zoom, the first 40 minutes is free. But if you have a group of 3 or less, then I think it's more unlimited, if I'm not mistaken.
So Heather Stevenson asked about anticipatory grief, how to go back to normal, how to process all the stuff that's happening and go back to normal. In fact, I'll add to that, what will normal be? So, is this a question to you, not just about grief, but if you follow Rando at all, about mourning, about life on the other side that's going to be different?
Fundamentally, one thing that has to happen is we necessarily have to adjust our expectations. I do think that normal is a problematic word, but normalcy, if it's something that that we believe that we can find some kind of ordinariness, I guess, in our lives, maybe kind of on a day-by-day basis, what is what is affirming to me? What is it that I can do that is a helpful activity, and not necessarily, we have to have kind of an open mind about what happens, what the future is going to look like, because we don't know what that reality is going to be. And that's a scary proposition, but it's kind of one of those things that we have to recognize it's a little bit out of our control. If there's something that we can do something to make things better, then we do it. But we don't always, we don't control all the outcomes, especially in the face of this little microbe.
I would also like to add that some of the things that I'm doing to try to have some semblance of something that's grounding is that I try to find my routine in the day. That's something that helps. So I'm still working, I'm still in the hospital, but I'm on flex time, which means that I'm only here certain hours of the day. And so it helps me when I know where I'm going to be at for a certain set of time. So if you're someone who like works well with a schedule, it might help you to have a schedule during this. But also like staying in touch with your body and what your body needs, I think is a great way to check in with yourself. So I think it's really easy for me to get bogged down by like several Zoom meetings in a day, because now that we have Zoom, it's like, let's have all the Zoom meetings. But making sure that I'm doing what I need for myself, like drinking water, staying hydrated. Am I going to bed at a reasonable time, even though I might not have to get up at the same time? Am I feeling myself in my body? Do I need to go outside and put my feet on the grass just to feel connected to something else? Just simple things. Like you don't have to do something extravagant in order to feel connected. It can be the most simple things, like your favorite cup of tea and just holding it and being mindful, like when you're eating, the taste of your food. I hope that's helpful.
Something from Yvette Campbell, and I think this is an important question. Well, it's really nice that we found new ways to connect. Her question was really, how can we identify when someone's going through shock and denial? Because we can all present it's easier to present a fair face sometimes electronically, isn't it?
That's just an extension of what we've been doing all along, because people put on a face in all social instances.
That's a tough one, because it took me a while to realize the shock that I had inside my own self. And it took me just, instead of being judgy of myself, instead I was asking myself questions like, why am I sleeping more? Why is it that I feel so tired? I'm doing less. Why am I so exhausted? Sometimes the shock factor, like to recognize it, even though they have like a face, is like you just have to listen maybe for some certain words or phrases. We call it not necessarily active listening, but like motivational listening and stuff, like asking people how they're feeling, like where do they feel that in their body, if you feel comfortable with them and have that kind of rapport, and just listen for like what comes up out of them, and then maybe guide it from there.
And sometimes all you can do is care for somebody. You may not be able to change whatever it is they're dealing with. If they're not aware of what's going on, there's no motivation to do anything about that.
Right.
You just have to do your best to love them as they are and take care of yourself.
So Betsy Bombeck's question was really somewhat similar, and it's thoughts about unfocused or unrecognized grieving. She says, it's challenging for me to recognize that grieving is what's going on beneath the surface, yet I know I don't feel normal. And again, going back to, how do we understand for ourselves, let alone for others, what is just normal adaptation to things that have changed, and what is problematic? Any hint?
I would write about it. I know that sounds like a quick antidote, but it's not. And even if I heard someone say self-reflection a little bit earlier, even if you write for 5 or 10 minutes a day about this time of COVID virus, you know, and how you're feeling, how it's affecting your life and those around you, I think that can be a good barometer for you. And it's listening to yourself. It's reverent listening to yourself.
I would sort of piggyback on what Kay just said. I found it very helpful to do a lot of reflective writing and journaling during this time to identify, you know, feelings that I was having and to see patterns in the entries that I make daily. That has been very helpful.
In terms of good responses or better responses to people who are expressing grief, I know that one of the things that we have to guard about is what I call Reader's Digest instant answers to the whenever God closes a door, you know, God opens a window kind of things, are the worst case after the death to hear someone say, well, God needed another flower in heaven, which I find an abomination. But are there things that you would suggest that we say or don't say to those who are obviously expressing grief right now?
Don't say snap out of it.
Right. I'd say if you're not really sure what to say, either err on the side of not saying anything, or also a good, like, you could always say, like, this must be really hard for you.
So I'd be remiss if I don't mention the Brene Brown YouTube on empathy versus sympathy, although one of my psychologist friends thinks that sympathy gets kind of a short shift there, but are you familiar with that? And I don't know if that's on the BCM's website. So, Dr. Rominger, it sounds like you need to leave, or I said sounds like, it looks like you need to leave us right now because you have a patient. Maybe one day we'll actually, since we work for the same organization and probably not too far away, maybe one day we'll actually meet. So we'll go ahead and thank you as we continue our conversation. Thank you, sir.
Great, thank you.
So I'm interested in if there are other questions and or if there are things that the panelists would like to raise that they didn't have a chance to say to begin with. And by the way, Kay, I think I know one of your colleagues, Dottie Curran, who I believe was one of your co-authors, who's a very dear person and has been a dear person to the chaplains here at the hospital.
Yes.
So we're having some other folks who must leave now. I want to thank Ruth Burkall for inviting me to be here today to help with this. And thanks for all of our panelists who gave it their time and all the people who've also signed in to be part of this. We have very important work to do. This is hard work, and we will all discover what normal is, and it may be a much wider scoop than we ever thought. Oh, I'm sorry, Peggy Dotson had one last question for those who are still, in regard to my mental emotional health question, are there indicators as to when we should refer?
I hate that Dr. Rominger had to go. He would have been a good reference point for that. But I usually listen for people when they start saying things like, you know, I just don't know if I can do this anymore, or like, you know, like just things that might necessarily might not be a red flag, but maybe an orange flag where you're kind of like, and if they're like just constantly going over things, that's when I would usually say, hey, you know, this is a lot that you're dealing with. Have you thought about talking to a professional? And always, like, I always frame it like, you know, I have a therapist. Like, I think even people who aren't struggling with things, I think it's great to have someone to talk to from a professional standpoint.
And I think if you're seeing patterns or people can identify that they're not sleeping, there's changing in their sleeping patterns, there's changes in their eating patterns.
Yes.
If they feel weepy a lot, there may be some signs of some depression. And that's a good time to refer people that they may want to talk to somebody else about it.